Yes, I believe crazy is quite a good word to describe it in many ways. I've had this strange feeling idea in the past few months that a certain segment of humanity is losing the ability to think rationally. There's a decrease in whether I call it IQ or whatever it may be. There's a diminishment of rational faculty as reflected in many ways on mainstream media, social media, and so on. And another segment of humanity is actually becoming more aware, more conscious, is not drawn into the regressive phase that some of humanity may be going through. It's not unusual for humanity to occasionally collectively regress to a lower state of consciousness. It has happened whenever a country or a collective has been taken over by an almost, one could say, toxic ideology that has completely taken possession of millions of people's minds. Look at, of course, National Socialism in Germany. The Maoist Cultural Revolution was quite crazy. What happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot, totally crazy ideas invaded millions of people's minds and reduced their ability to actually engage in rational thinking and totally, and these are just a few examples of totally toxic and irrational thoughts taking over people's minds. To some extent, I've been seeing this happening collectively, not just in one country, in quite a few many Western countries that I'm aware of, but it has not affected everybody. Some people have managed to remain aware. They have not been, one could say, infected by what one could perhaps call a mental virus or mental viruses that reduce people's ability to actually see reality. Reality then gets distorted through the veil of these mental viruses that have taken over people's minds. This is a more serious pandemic than anything that happens on the physical level as far as pandemics are concerned, the actual viruses. Actually, I don't know if you've read, Carl Jung said that the greatest danger that humanity faces is not from any external force like natural disasters or diseases or pandemics. He said the greatest danger that humanity faces is collective psychosis. So to some extent, I see it happening not quite as extreme yet as in places like Maoist China or Cambodia, where at the time of Pol Pot, anybody who could read and write, or anybody, if you wear glasses, you were an enemy of the people because you were regarded as the oppressor and likely to be killed. 1/3 or more of the population got exterminated through insanity taking over people's minds, so that you no longer can see reality as it is. The famous example from 1984, Orwell, you have to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. And right. If you don't believe it, then you are the enemy.
Which is sort of what we're being told these days from some pretty powerful people that are pushing bad ideas. But I suspect that you think if more people lived in the moment, if more people harness the power of now, that would be the best inoculation from this mind virus?
Yes, inoculation or immunity. I think I would use immunity. Mm-hmm. The key is what we could call awareness, or I sometimes call it presence. Awareness or presence is nothing complicated, or it's the ability to become aware of your thoughts. So you can take a step back and observe what thoughts are going through your head. For example, when this ability arises, I call that the beginning of a spiritual awakening. Spiritual is no longer being completely trapped and identified with the movement of thinking. This is particularly important now. The danger of viral infection on a mental level has always been there, but it's now become magnified by the technology that we now have. A toxic idea, a toxic thought can spread like wildfire through the internet within a few days and can take possession or become lodged in countless people's minds. And once a thought has become lodged, then it will attract associated thoughts that resonate with it. And then suddenly you see reality through the veil of that irrational thinking. But you don't know that this is happening because you do not have the immunity of awareness. Awareness is the ability to know what your mind is doing. It's also, for example, the ability, I think it was Aristotle who talked about the ability of having two conflicting thoughts in your mind without necessarily identifying with either. That implies there is an awareness there. Without awareness, one thought will draw you in completely. You will identify with completely. And then everything else is then disregarded or regarded as threatening. The egoic self it identifies with one particular position. And this is just one example. There are many similar examples one could give. It identifies with one position, and then everything else is regarded as whatever the term is. What are the favorite terms these days? Disinformation or whatever. Anyone who disagrees with my mental position, that's disinformation. We know many examples of that.
How do you actually climb out of something if you're unaware of it at some level?
Yes, to become aware of one's thinking, there's no easy answer to that. To many people, it happens naturally. For example, it tends to happen sometimes to people on a personal level whose thinking becomes so negative. In other words, the stories they tell themselves, narratives that people have in their heads, in their minds. My life is so dreadful, and I've been treated so unfairly by society and life, and I've had everything bad always happens to me. I know these things because when I was young, I had similar thoughts in my mind, very negative narratives. For some people, the negative narratives are about the world out there, which is everything is evil and they're out to sabotage me and so on. Or the negative narrative may be about myself. There's something wrong with me. Whatever it may be, it leads to an enormous amount of suffering, emotional suffering, because the emotion is usually a reflection of what you're telling yourself in your mind, creates a reflection on the emotional level. So if your narrative is very negative, you then experience very negative emotions, anger, sadness, resentment. Or if your narrative is very much directed towards the future, the fearful future, then there's a lot of anxiety and fear because the future is so uncertain. So people who go into a lot of suffering, at some point, they sometimes realize that the suffering they experience is actually produced by their own minds. For example, somebody might suddenly wake up and say, for the past few hours, I've been engaged in negative thinking about myself and the world. Wow, isn't that amazing? And I have these thoughts that come back again. They recur again and again, thoughts about myself, things I tell myself about myself. So these thoughts are creating so much suffering. You can stand back and say, well, I'm so negative. Why am I always criticizing people? Why am I always complaining about everything? This is the beginning of becoming aware of what's happening. Complaining is a big pattern in many people's minds. They love complaining, complaining about what's out there, complaining about my life, complaining about them. And I'm not talking about complaining where you have the ability to change a situation. Then sometimes it's good to speak out when there's possibility of change. But in many cases, people just complain because it makes the ego feel bigger, because the more I complain about others, the bigger my ego feels, because I'm right and they are all wrong. And the ego loves to be right.
You're perfectly spelling out exactly why I get off social media, because we all suffer from that. If I get a lot of retweets, it has a certain dopamine effect to me, or sometimes I open it up and I'll look for negative comments, even though I don't consider myself a negative person.
Yes, no, but a very important thing when you have interviews or dialogues with people, there's a background field of a peaceful coming together, even if what your opinion and the person you're interviewing maybe have very different viewpoints, very different thoughts. Nevertheless, you're not so identified with the viewpoint, the mental position, that anybody who questions your viewpoint is unconsciously regarded as an enemy that needs to be defeated. So that you have an awareness, which is a dimension of consciousness that is extremely important for humans to realize within themselves. Because if you're not aware of what your mind is doing, so there's some separation from the mental position, which is the thought, and who you are. Who you are is the aware presence in the background that frees you from being possessed by thoughts, by narratives, by mental positions. And so that takes the ego out of the interaction. And then you can have a fruitful interaction. So you don't need to give up your viewpoints or your mental positions, but not be totally identified with it, so that anybody who questions it becomes your enemy.